Chapter 116. The Silent Theft. The alleyway behind Magister Illyrio's manse was narrow, choked with shadows, and smelled faintly of rotting fruit and damp earth. Jon Stark stood at the base of the massive brick wall. It rose 15 feet into the night sky, its surface smooth and imposing. Along the upper ridge, the jagged, cruel teeth of broken glass and rusted iron shards glittered menacingly in the pale moonlight, designed to rip the hands of any thief foolish enough to attempt to climb. Arthur Dayne stood a few paces back, enveloped entirely in the gloom. Anna waited near the mouth of the alley, her gray eyes scanning the dark street for any signs of the city watch. Arya stood perfectly still beside Arthur, a dark wool scarf wrapped securely around her lower face, watching her older brother with intense, unblinking focus. Jon did not carry a rope. He did not ask for a boost. He closed his eyes and let out a slow, measured breath. The chaotic, overwhelming noise of Pentos, the distant barking of dogs, the muffled shouts from the taverns in the lower city, the shifting of the wind, faded into a dull, manageable hum. He felt the firm, packed earth beneath his boots. He drew the latent, deep power of the world into his center, coiling it tightly into the muscles of his legs like a compressed steel spring. Jon opened his eyes. They were sharp, clear, and entirely devoid of hesitation. He didn't run. He took a single, fluid step forward and launched himself upward. The force carried him. He sailed silently through the air, clearing the 15-foot span with unnatural, terrifying grace. For a fraction of a second, he hovered at the apex of the leap, directly above the lethal, jagged glass embedded in the mortar. He tucked his knees, flipped his body over the razor-sharp edge without snagging a single thread of his dark leather cloak, and dropped into the grounds of the manse. He landed on the soft soil of the inner gardens. His boots made absolutely no sound. He absorbed the impact perfectly, dropping into a low crouch behind a thick hedge of exotic, sweet-smelling night blooms. He remained perfectly still for 10 seconds, letting his senses sweep the immediate area. The gardens were vast, filled with tiered fountains, marble statues, and manicured fruit trees. And just as Castle had reported, the grounds were guarded. Footsteps crunched lazily on a gravel path nearby. Jon shifted his weight, pressing himself deeper into the shadows of the hedge. Through the leaves, he saw two Sellswords slowly walking the edge of the gardens. They were not the disciplined, unspeaking Unsullied who guarded the front gates. These were free riders. One was a broad-shouldered Pentoshi with a scarred cheek. The other was a lean Tyroshi with a beard dyed a ridiculous shade of bright green. They were supposed to be watching the walls for assassins. Instead, they were entirely focused on avoiding work. "I am telling you, Marrow," the green-bearded Tyroshi complained, aggressively peeling a stolen orange with a small dagger. "If the horse lords arrive tomorrow at dawn, I am hiding in the deepest corner of the wine cellar until they ride away. Illyrio pays us to guard the grounds, Vario," the scarred Pentoshi grunted, leaning heavily on his spear. "If the Magister finds you hiding with the casks, he will have the Unsullied whip the skin from your back." "I would rather take a whipping from a eunuch than face a Dothraki blood rider," Vario retorted, tossing an orange peel onto the pristine marble path. "They say the blood riders braid bells into their hair. A bell for every man they kill. I do not wish to be a bell, Marrow. I am a Sellsword, not a martyr." "Then do not fight them," Marrow reasoned, scratching his neck beneath his rusted chainmail. "Just bow low, keep your eyes on the dirt, and offer them wine. The Magister is giving Khal Drogo the silver-haired Targaryen girl. The savages will be far too busy dragging her back to their tents to notice two guards by the fountain." Jon's jaw tightened at the casual cruelty of the Sellswords, but he did not let his anger spike. Anger clouded the mind. He needed them to move past his position so he could reach the heavy cedar doors of the main house. But the two guards had stopped walking. Vario had decided to sit on the edge of a marble fountain just 10 feet from Jon's hiding spot to finish peeling his fruit, while Marrow leaned against a statue, looking thoroughly bored. Jon needed a distraction. He didn't reach for a stone. He focused his awareness on Vario's heavy leather coin pouch, which dangled loosely from the Tyroshi's belt. With a subtle, precise mental twist, Jon snapped the worn leather cord binding the pouch. The pouch hit the marble tiles. A dozen silver stags spilled out, clattering loudly against the stone. Vario cursed loudly, dropping his orange and scrambling to his hands and knees to gather his coin. Marrow barked a harsh, mocking laugh. "You have hands like a drunken bear, Vario. Can't even hold onto your own silver." "I didn't touch it," Vario snapped, frantically sweeping the coins together in the dark. The leather was rotten. Help me find them before they roll into the water. You useless ox. Find your own coin? Marrow sneered, though he took a step forward, his greedy eyes scanning the ground to see if he could quietly pocket a stag for himself. As both guards bent over the stone path, entirely consumed by the spilled silver and their bickering, Jon moved. He flowed out from behind the hedge like a wisp of smoke. He crossed the open expanse of the gravel path in 3 long, rapid strides, making less noise than a falling leaf. He slipped past the distracted Sellswords and melted into the deep shadows covering the rear entrance of the manse. He reached the heavy cedar doors. They were locked. Jon did not pick the lock. He placed his gloved hand flat against the wood, directly over the heavy iron mechanism. He sent a sharp, focused pulse of energy straight into the iron. The heavy tumblers inside the lock shifted and clicked open with a faint, metallic snick. Jon turned the iron ring, opened the door a fraction of an inch, slipped inside, and pulled it silently shut behind him. The interior of Magister Illyrio's manse was a staggering display of wealth. The floors were polished white marble, covered by thick, intricate Myrish carpets that muffled the sound of footsteps. The air was warm and smelled of expensive incense and roasted meats lingering from the evening meals. Soft, hooded lanterns provided a dim, golden light along the wide corridors. Jon closed his eyes. The house was vast, a labyrinth of guest chambers, servant quarters, and receiving halls. Searching room by room would take hours and inevitably lead to discovery. He needed to find the target immediately. He extended his awareness, letting his mind drift through the walls and floors. He felt the heavy, sluggish life signatures of the sleeping servants on the lower levels. He felt the rigid, unmoving discipline of the unsullied standing watch at the front gates. Their minds were blank, devoid of fear or desire, shaped entirely for obedience. Then, on the 3rd floor, he found what he was looking for. It was not a normal life signature. It did not feel like the tired, earthy pulse of the Pentos guards. Felt like heat. He sensed 2 distinct sources of this heat. One was located in a large suite in the eastern wing. It was a jagged, erratic, and deeply unstable fire. It felt like rotting copper and splintered glass in his mind. It was the exact, unstable frequency of a mind consuming itself, the lingering poison of the Mad King. Viserys. Jon ignored it. Leaving the Beggar King behind was the right choice. He swept his focus to the western wing. There, in a secluded chamber overlooking the sea, he found the second source. It was a softer, cleaner heat, but it was trembling violently. It radiated absolute, suffocating terror. The signature was small, isolated, and wide awake. Daenerys. Jon opened his eyes and moved. He took the grand, sweeping marble staircase 2 steps at a time. His dark leather boots made absolutely no sound against the stone. He navigated the 2nd floor landing, slipping behind a heavy velvet tapestry as a pair of drowsy house servants carried a tray of empty wine goblets down the hall. They walked past him, entirely unaware that the deadliest shadow in the north was standing less than an arm's length away. Jon reached the 3rd floor. The corridor leading to the western wing was empty. He found the heavy, ornately carved oak door of the chamber. He didn't bother checking the lock. He simply reached out and released the iron tumblers with a subtle push of the force. He turned the handle and slipped inside, closing the door behind him. The chamber was lavish. Thick silk curtains hung from the high windows, and a massive 4-poster bed dominated the center of the room. Daenerys Targaryen was not in the bed. She was standing near the large, arched window, looking out over the moonlit waters of the narrow sea. She wore a simple, pale linen shift. Her silver-blonde hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of moonlight. She was weeping. It was a silent, desperate weeping. Her thin shoulders shook as she stared out at the dark water. She knew the sun would rise in a few short hours, and with the dawn the horse lords would arrive. She had heard the vicious, mocking whispers of her brother. She knew she was to be traded to the savage call. She was a princess of a fallen dynasty, entirely alone in the world, waiting for the monsters to come and claim her. Jon stood in the shadows near the door. He looked at the girl. He noticed a small, frayed cloth bundle sitting on her bed. It contained 2 thin, patched dresses and a single pair of riding boots. It was the entirety of the dowry her brother had provided for her sale to the Dothraki. A brief, sharp pang of sympathy struck Jon's chest. She looked so small, so utterly broken by the cruelty of the men who controlled her life. But Jon was not there to offer comfort. He was not a knight from the songs, arriving to dry a princess's tears and swear his sword to her cause. He was a weapon of the North, trained to execute a flawless rescue. Arthur Dane had been absolutely correct. If Jon stepped into the light and tried to explain his presence, her terror would instantly turn to panic. She would scream, the guards would swarm the room, and they would all die. Jon shoved his sympathy aside, locking his emotions behind the unyielding, cold discipline of his training. He moved. He crossed the thick Myrish carpet in a blur of dark leather. He was a silent, lethal shadow closing the distance in less than a heartbeat. Daenerys sensed a shift in the air, a sudden, terrifying instinct that she was no longer alone in the room. She gasped, turning away from the window, her violet eyes going wide with pure horror as a dark figure materialized right behind her. She inhaled sharply, her lungs filling with air to let out a piercing, desperate scream for the guards. She never made a sound. Before the breath could even reach her vocal cords, Jon struck. His gloved hand shot forward with absolute precision. He struck the side of her neck, pressing hard against the vital blood vessel, applying a sharp, measured burst of power. It was a technique designed to immediately disrupt the flow of blood to the head without causing permanent damage. Daenerys' eyes rolled back. The scream died in her throat. Her body instantly went limp. Jon caught her before her knees could buckle. He wrapped his arms securely around her waist and shoulders, easing her silently to the floor. He checked her pulse. It was steady and strong. She was completely unconscious. The strike had taken less than 2 seconds. Jon did not waste time. He pulled a thick, heavy dark wool cloak from his pack and wrapped it tightly around her, ensuring her striking silver hair and pale shift were completely covered. He lifted her effortlessly, hoisting her over his shoulder. She was light, but the dead weight was still substantial. Jon adjusted her position, ensuring she was balanced perfectly. He drew a deep breath, marshaling the force to sustain his stamina. He carried the blood of the dragon, and the North was bringing her home. He slipped back out the heavy oak door. The descent through the manse was more perilous than the ascent. Carrying a hostage shifted his balance and severely restricted his speed. He could not run. He had to move with slow, deliberate care. He paused at the top of the grand staircase, waiting for a lone guard to pass through the lower hall. The manse was completely quiet, settling into the deepest, darkest hour of the night. Jon carried her down the marble steps, sticking to the shadows hugging the walls. He navigated the lower corridors, ignoring the distant, muted snores of the sleeping servants. He reached the rear cedar doors, pushed them open, and stepped back out into the cool, night air of the gardens. He moved back toward the brick wall, staying low behind the manicured hedges. As he neared the wall, he heard voices. Vario and Marrow were still there. "I am telling you, Marrow, I didn't drop it," Vario hissed, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet garden. The green-bearded Tyroshi was currently on his hands and knees, sifting through the dirt with a small lantern. "I was sitting right here. The pouch just snapped. You drank too much of the Magister's wine and fumbled your own purse, you idiot," Marrow replied, leaning against the fountain, making absolutely no effort to help his companion look for the lost silver stags. "Just admit your fingers are useless." "I am missing 3 stags," Vario complained bitterly. 3. If you pocketed them while I was looking under the bench. "I didn't touch your miserable silver," Marrow snorted. "Maybe a ghost took them." Jon crouched behind a marble statue of a weeping goddess, Daenerys' unconscious body draped heavily over his shoulder. The 2 Sellswords were standing directly between him and the section of the wall he needed to jump. He could not slip past them this time. The rustle of the heavy wool cloak or the shifting of her weight would give him away. He needed to move them. Jon looked around the dark garden. A few yards away from the Sellswords, near a heavy iron gate leading to the kitchens, sat a large stack of empty wine casks. Jon focused his mind. He extended a solid, heavy pulse of power toward the bottom of the stack. With a loud, wooden crack, the bottom cask shifted. The entire stack became unbalanced. 3 heavy, empty wooden barrels tumbled to the ground, bouncing loudly against the cobblestones and rolling toward the kitchen doors. Both Sellswords jumped, their hands flying to their swords. "What the hell was that?" Vario gasped, scrambling to his feet and dropping his lantern. "Someone is at the kitchen gates," Marrow hissed, drawing his blade, his previous boredom vanishing instantly. The fear of Dothraki assassins or rival thieves clearly overriding his laziness. "Come on. If someone steals the Magister's reserves, he'll hang us. The two mercenaries ran toward the kitchen courtyard, their chainmail jingling loudly in the night, entirely abandoning their post by the wall. They reached the courtyard and found the heavy wooden barrels scattered across the cobblestones. But the area was completely empty. There were no thieves, no assassins, and no shadows. Vario, already terrified of the dark, pointed a shaking finger at the empty space. "I told you," Vario hissed, backing away toward the main house. "First the coins, now the barrels. This manse is haunted by a Pentoshi ghost." Marrow let out a long, suffering groan, rubbing his face. "If you don't help me stack these back up before the Magister wakes, I'll make a ghost out of you myself," he threatened, though his own eyes darted nervously around the dark courtyard. Back by the wall, John didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly to the base of the 15-foot brick structure. He looked up at the jagged glass lining the top. Leaping the wall unburdened was simple. Leaping the wall while carrying the dead weight of a 17-year-old girl required an immense amount of raw power. John shifted Daenerys firmly onto his left shoulder, wrapping his left arm tightly around her legs to secure her. He bent his knees, dropping his weight deep into the earth. He pulled the force into his core, letting it flood his legs until his muscles burned with the suppressed energy. He pushed off the dirt. The power of the leap was staggering. John rocketed upward into the night air. The heavy weight of the girl threatened to pull him backward, throwing off his balance, but John's core was made of iron. He adjusted his posture mid-air, clearing the razor-sharp glass by mere inches. He crested the wall and began to fall toward the dark alleyway on the other side. The massive surge of power strained his body to its absolute limit. When he landed on the cobblestones, his knees buckled hard against the stone. A sharp, coppery taste flooded the back of his mouth. He stumbled, unable to bear the combined weight as his legs briefly gave out. Arthur Dayne stepped out of the shadows. As John dropped, Arthur raised his strong arms and caught Daenerys seamlessly. The legendary knight absorbed the weight of the girl without a single grunt of exertion, allowing John to fall lightly to one knee and catch his breath. The moonlight caught the pale, sleeping face and the striking silver hair spilling from beneath the dark wool cloak. For a fraction of a second, the stoic sword of the morning froze. He did not see a stranger in his arms. He saw the ghost of Queen Riella and the lingering echoes of his queen, Rhaegar. A heavy sorrow tightened Arthur's chest. He adjusted his grip, pulling the last Targaryen princess securely against his chest, quietly fulfilling the Kingsguard vow he had failed to uphold at the Trident. "I have her," Arthur murmured quietly. The entire rescue, from the moment John went over the wall to the moment he returned, had taken less than 10 minutes. Anna stepped out of the gloom, her gray eyes inspecting the bundle in Arthur's arms. She pulled the dark wool cloak back slightly, revealing the incredibly thin, pale arms of the Targaryen princess. Arya stepped out from behind Arthur, pulling her dark scarf down. Her gray eyes were wide with genuine, unadulterated awe. She had spent the last 10 minutes pacing the alleyway, convinced John was going to get caught. "You actually did it?" Arya whispered, staring at her brother as he stood back up. "You went into a fortress, stole a princess, and came back without making a sound." "Quiet, Arya," Anna commanded softly, pulling the girl's scarf back up over her mouth. "The work is not over. We are still in enemy territory." Arthur adjusted Daenerys in his arms, holding her securely against his chest. "We move to the docks. Fast and quiet. Keep to the shadows." The small northern party moved out of the alleyway, beginning the tense journey back through the winding, cobblestone streets of Pentos. The upper city was asleep, but the streets were not entirely empty. The city watch maintained irregular patrols. As they turned a narrow corner near a high-walled garden, a drunken patrol of spear-carrying watchmen stumbled out of a tavern directly into their path. They were less than 30 paces away, laughing loudly. Arthur tensed, his hand sliding beneath his cloak to grip the hilt of dawn. A fight in the streets would rouse the entire district. Before Arthur could draw his blade, Arya moved. She slipped seamlessly into an adjacent, pitch-black side alley. With a swift kick, she sent a heavy clay pot shattering against the brick wall. Immediately after, she let out a flawless, ear-piercing screech that sounded exactly like two furious alley cats fighting over a scrap of meat. The drunken guards stopped, cursing the sudden noise. "Damned beasts," one of them grumbled, turning his spear toward the dark side alley. "I'll skin them for boots. Go on. Get out of here." The patrol staggered down the wrong alley to investigate the noise. The northern party slipped past the main street completely unseen, Arthur giving Arya a brief, deeply impressed nod of approval as she seamlessly rejoined them. Thanks to the absolute discipline of the Northmen and the silencing effect of the Grey Path, the rest of the journey went without incident. They left the wealthy manses behind, descending into the foul-smelling, chaotic maze of the lower docks. Even in the dead of night, the harbor was alive with illicit activity. Smugglers unloading crates, drunken sailors passed out in the alleys, and the low, muffled sounds of tavern brawls. Arthur, Anna, and Jon pulled their hoods low. They walked purposefully, their faces hidden, looking like nothing more than a group of rough mercenaries hauling a drunken comrade back to their ship. In the lower docks of Pentos, a man carrying a limp body over his shoulder was too common a sight to warrant a second glance. They reached the hidden, rotting pier where the Winter's Lance was berthed. The ship was completely dark. No lanterns burned. The sails were already half unfurled, waiting only for the wind. Castle and Allen stood near the base of the gangplank, their swords drawn and hidden beneath their heavy cloaks. When they saw Arthur carrying the dark bundle, they immediately stepped aside, gesturing urgently toward the deck. The party hurried up the wooden plank. The moment Arthur's boots hit the main deck, the ship sprang into silent, furious motion. "Cast off," Anna ordered, her voice a low, sharp whisper. The crew moved perfectly, demonstrating the terrifying discipline of the North. There were no shouted orders. The crew used heavy leather wraps, thickly coated in goose grease, wrapped tightly over the pulleys and oarlocks to muffle any sound of grinding wood. The single slipknot holding the heavy mooring lines was pulled. The ropes slid quietly into the dark water. The crew hauled on the greased rigging, catching the strong offshore breeze. The massive ship glided smoothly away from the rotting wooden piers without a single creak of timber or splash of water, melting into the sea mist like a true phantom. Arthur carried Daenerys straight into the captain's cabin, laying her gently on the narrow wooden cot. Anna pulled a heavy wool blanket over her to ward off the sea chill. Jon stood at the stern of the ship, watching the sprawling, lantern-lit hills of Pentos shrink into the distance. The city was completely quiet. No alarm bells were ringing in the upper city. Magister Illyrio and Viserys Targaryen were sleeping soundly in their luxurious beds, entirely unaware that the prize they intended to sell to the Dothraki was currently sailing away on a northern ship. Arya walked up beside Jon, leaning against the wooden railing. She pulled her scarf down, taking a deep breath of the clean, salty sea air. "Are we taking her straight to see Dragon Point?" Arya asked, looking back at the shrinking city. "Yes," Jon said quietly, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon as he tasted the last of the copper in his mouth. "She will be safe there. The South will not find her." Arya looked at her brother, a newfound respect shining in her eyes. "You really are a ghost, Jon." Jon didn't smile. He just turned away from the railing and looked toward the captain's cabin. He had executed the rescue flawlessly. He had saved the girl from a fate worse than death. But as the Winter's Lance cut silently through the dark waters of the narrow sea, Jon knew the hardest part of the mission was still to come. When the sun rose, the Targaryen princess was going to wake up in a strange room, surrounded by strangers from a kingdom she had been taught to hate. And Jon Stark was going to have to explain to a girl who believed he was an assassin why he had just stolen her from her only living family. Chapter 117. The Ghosts of the Past. The waking did not come with a sudden, dramatic gasp. It came slowly, accompanied by the deep, rhythmic groan of heavy timbers and the undeniable, swaying motion of a ship at sea. Daenerys Targaryen opened her eyes. For a long moment, she simply stared at the low, curved wooden ceiling above her. The air in the room was cool and smelled of salt, old canvas, and waxed wood. It was entirely devoid of the cloying incense and roasted spices of Magister Illyrio's manse. She tried to sit up, and a dull, throbbing ache flared at the side of her neck. She pressed her fingers to the tender skin, her memories slowly returning. She remembered the dark chamber in Pentos. She remembered the moonlight on the water, her own silent tears, and the sudden, terrifying shift in the shadows. A figure in dark leather. A sharp, precise strike. Then absolute blackness. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the lingering fog in her mind. She pulled the thick, heavy wool blanket up to her chin, scrambling backward until her spine hit the wooden bulkhead of the narrow cot. She was not alone in the cabin. Sitting across the small space, illuminated by the pale morning light filtering through a thick glass porthole, were two women. There were no men. There were no rough sellswords, no towering knights, and no Dothraki screamers to overwhelm her. There were only two women, dressed in practical, dark boiled leather and thick gray wool. The older woman sat on a wooden stool, casually sharpening a short hunting knife with a whetstone. Her hair was a deep, rich auburn, pulled back in a tight braid, and her gray eyes were calm and assessing. The younger woman, a girl really perhaps a few years younger than Daenerys herself, sat cross-legged on a crate. She had a long face, unruly dark hair, and storm-gray eyes that watched Daenerys with intense curiosity, much like a wolf watching a new addition to the pack. "You are awake," the older woman said quietly. She did not raise her voice, nor did she make any sudden movements. She set the whetstone and the knife down on a small table, keeping her hands entirely visible. Daenerys stared at them, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent her entire life running from the usurper's hired knives. She had expected to wake in a dungeon, or in the foul-smelling hold of a slaver's cog. She had not expected this quiet, sparse cabin and the calm demeanor of these strangers. "Who are you?" Daenerys asked. Her voice was hoarse, trembling slightly despite her desperate attempt to sound regal. "Where am I?" "You are on a ship, sailing west across the narrow sea," the older woman answered smoothly. "My name is Anna. This is my niece, Arya. We are of the North." Daenerys's breath hitched. The North, the usurper's closest friends. The wolves who had marched into King's Landing and helped slaughter her family. Her brother Viserys had told her the tales 1,000 times. The Lord of Winterfell was a cold, heartless monster who fed Targaryen children to his hounds. "You are the usurper's dogs," Daenerys whispered, her violet eyes wide with terror. She pressed herself harder against the wooden planks. "You have come to kill me. If we wanted to kill you, princess, we would have left you in the dark in Pentos," Anna replied, her voice remaining perfectly flat and pragmatic. "We did not cross the sea to spill your blood. We came to take you away from the manse." Arya leaned forward from her crate, her fierce gray eyes narrowing slightly. "We are Northmen, yes, but we are not here for King Robert. We came on behalf of Elia Martell." Daenerys froze. The name hung in the cold, salty air of the cabin, completely defying everything she knew to be true. "Elia Martell?" Daenerys repeated. She knew the Princess of Dorne and her daughter, Rhaenys, had survived the sack of King's Landing. Viserys had cursed their names 1,000 times. He called them cowards and traitors for living comfortably as wards of the North while the true heirs of the dragon starved in exile. "My good sister hides behind the walls of Winterfell," Daenerys said, her voice wavering as a confusing mixture of anger and sorrow welled up inside her. "She lives under the roof of the men who helped murder my family. Why would she send you to me?" "She sent us to bring you to safety," Anna stated plainly. "If she cared for our safety, why didn't she contact us?" Daenerys asked, clutching the wool blanket tighter, the memory of her grueling childhood flashing before her eyes. "Why did she leave us to beg for bread? We sold everything for a roof over our heads. What does she want from us now, all of a sudden?" Anna sighed softly, the harsh lines of her face softening just a fraction. "She did not contact you because it was too dangerous, Daenerys," Anna explained gently. "Elia is a guest in Winterfell, but in the eyes of the Iron Throne, she is still a hostage. If King Robert Baratheon had discovered that Elia Martell was exchanging letters with the exiled Targaryen heirs, he would have demanded her head, and the heads of everyone in the North who harbored her. Lord Stark protected her, but he could not risk a war with the crown over a raven scroll. But she didn't abandon you. Who do you think paid for the house with the red door?" Daenerys blinked, completely caught off guard by the mention of the only place she had ever considered a home. "Ser Willem Darry. Ser Willem was a loyal knight, but loyal knights in exile do not easily find gold to buy large houses in Bravos," Anna corrected smoothly. "Elia Martell and Lady Ashera Stark used merchants operating out of White Harbor to smuggle heavy coin across the narrow sea. They funded Ser Willem quietly. They made sure you had a roof, food, and safety while you were a child." Daenerys stared at the wooden floorboards, the house with the red door, the lemon tree outside her window, the warm, soft beds. It had all been provided by the good sister she thought had abandoned them to the capital's wolves. "But then Ser Willem died," Daenerys whispered, the old grief tightening her throat. Anna, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret, said, "Without Darry to receive the coin, they had no trusted intermediaries. Viserys dragged you from city to city, constantly moving. And your brother grew unstable. He was prone to terrible fits of anger. It became impossible for northern agents to approach him without drawing the attention of the spider's spies. He sold everything, Daenerys murmured, a solitary tear escaping her eye as the shame of their begging years washed over her. He sold our mother's jewels. He sold her rings. He even sold her crown to buy our passage and our meals. Anna reached beneath the small wooden table and pulled forth a heavy, brass-bound chest. She unlocked the latch and lifted the lid. Viserys sold them to anonymous merchants in the free cities, Anna said quietly. But those merchants did not melt them down or sell them to magisters. Anna reached into the chest and pulled out a heavy pouch of dark velvet. She untied the drawstrings and carefully tipped the contents into her hands. Sitting in the calloused palms of the northern woman was a slender, elegant crown of pale gold, wrought in the shape of a three-headed dragon, its eyes set with small, glittering rubies. The crown of Queen Rhaella Targaryen. Daenerys gasped. Her hands let go of the blanket, reaching out trembling fingers toward the gold. Every time your brother sold a piece of your mother's legacy, Anna explained softly, Elia and Ashera used the merchants of the north to buy it back at a higher price. They gathered every ring, every necklace, and this crown. They are all safely secured in Winterfell right now, waiting for you. Anna extended her hands, offering the crown to the girl. Daenerys took the delicate gold headpiece. The metal was cold, but to her, it felt heavier than a mountain. It was the only tangible piece of her mother she had ever known. She held it to her chest, bowing her head as a few quiet, desperately sad tears slipped down her cheeks, falling onto the fine silk of her dress. For years, she had believed the world was entirely cruel, filled only with men who wished to use her, kill her, or sell her. To learn that an invisible shield of protection had been hovering over her from the very kingdom she had been taught to hate was overwhelming. Arya watched the older girl cry, her fierce gray eyes softening with understanding. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just stood quietly, granting Daenerys the space to grieve for the years she had lost. After a few moments, Daenerys took a deep, shuddering breath. She wiped the tears from her pale cheeks with the back of her hand, forcing her spine straight. She carefully set the golden crown beside her on the cot and looked at Anna. If she could not contact us before? Daenerys asked, her voice steadying as the blood of the dragon reasserted itself. What does she want from me now? Why send you to steal me in the dead of night? Anna shook her head slowly. She doesn't want anything from you, Daenerys. Neither does Lord Stark. You are not a hostage, and you are not a pawn to be traded. Then why? Because of Illyrio Mopatis? Anna answered, her tone turning cold and hard as iron. We have spies across the ocean. We knew what Viserys and the Magister were planning. We knew they intended to sell you to Khal Drogo in exchange for a Dothraki horde. Daenerys flinched at the name of the warlord, the sheer terror of that fate still fresh in her mind. No girl deserves to be sold to a monster to buy a madman an army, Anna stated, her gray eyes fierce with a protective anger that stemmed directly from her own tragic past. We did not steal you to use you. We stole you to rescue you from a terrible wedding. That is all. Daenerys searched the woman's face. In all her life, every person who had offered her a hand had demanded a piece of her soul in return. Illyrio had demanded her obedience. Her brother had demanded her complete subservience. But these Northmen had simply pulled her from the fire, asking nothing. Daenerys gave a slow, measured nod, finally accepting the truth of her salvation. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed against her chest for the last moon finally began to lift. Then another thought struck her. She looked down at her hands. What about my brother? Daenerys asked quietly. She did not sound frantic or desperate. She sounded resigned. What is going to happen to Viserys now? Anna leaned back on her stool, shrugging her shoulders with absolute, pragmatic indifference. Who knows what will happen in Pentos? The Dothraki are arriving, and the Magister no longer has a bride to offer them. The Horse Lords are not known for their forgiving nature when a bargain is broken. Anna looked at the girl closely. We left no tracks. They will not know how you vanished. If your brother is smart, he will realize the danger he is in. He should escape the manse and flee the city as soon as he realizes you are gone, to save his own life. Anna raised a single, questioning eyebrow at the young princess. He is smart, right? Daenerys froze. The question hung in the air. Daenerys thought of Viserys. She thought of his towering, irrational rages. She thought of how he would react to finding her room empty. He would not calculate the danger. He would not slip quietly away into the dawn. He would scream. He would tear the manse apart. He would accuse Illyrio of betrayal. Viserys was entirely mad. And his madness, without her there to vent his rages, would almost certainly get him killed before the sun set. Daenerys looked at the wooden floorboards. She knew the truth, but the habit of protecting her brother's image was deeply ingrained. She didn't know what to say. Should she lie to these women who had just saved her? Or should she admit that the last king of House Targaryen was a delusional fool marching toward his own execution? Slowly, reluctantly, Daenerys offered a faint, hesitant nod. Yes, he will run. Anna saw the hesitation. She saw the truth hidden in the girl's violet eyes. But the northern woman did not press the issue. The fate of Viserys Targaryen was no longer their concern. Come, Anna said, standing up and gesturing toward the heavy oak door of the cabin. The air in here is stale. You should see the sea. Daenerys stood up on shaky legs. She picked up the heavy wool blanket and draped it tightly over her shoulders to ward off the chill, leaving the slender gold crown resting safely in the velvet bag on the table. She followed Anna and Arya out of the cabin and stepped onto the main deck of the Winter's Lance. The cold, biting wind of the narrow sea hit her instantly, smelling of salt and endless freedom. The sky was a pale, unbroken blue. The ship was cutting through the gray-green waves with immense, quiet speed. The crew moved around the deck with disciplined precision, entirely ignoring the silver-haired girl emerging from the hold. Near the helm stood two figures. One was a tall, lean man with silver-streaked hair and striking violet eyes, dressed in worn leather armor. He possessed an aura of calm, lethal grace. Standing beside him was a young boy, same age as herself. He had dark hair, solemn gray eyes, and wore a simple, unadorned gray cloak. Anna led Daenerys across the deck toward them. "Daenerys," Anna said, keeping the introductions brief and pragmatic. "This is Arthur Dayne. He commands the guard." Daenerys looked at the man's violet eyes. He offered a respectful, incredibly formal bow that spoke of a high court, not a mercenary ship. He did not introduce himself as the Sword of the Morning, but the sorrow and silent oath in his gaze made Daenerys feel oddly safe. "And this," Anna continued, gesturing to the solemn, dark-haired boy, "is Jon. He is my nephew." Jon gave a brief, polite nod of his head. "He is the shadow who carried you out of the manse," Anna explained plainly. "He bypassed the guards and pulled you over the wall." Daenerys looked at Jon. He was not much taller than her, yet he had somehow breached an impenetrable fortress, bypassed unsullied guards, and carried her dead weight over a towering brick wall without making a sound. He was the one who had struck her in the dark. She reached up, rubbing the faint bruise on her neck. She looked at Jon's gray eyes, finding no cruelty in them, only a quiet, deep focus. "You struck me," Daenerys said softly. "I did," Jon admitted, his voice even and unapologetic. "If I had spoken to you, you would have screamed. We would have been discovered, and you would be sitting in a Dothraki tent right now." Daenerys considered his words. The brutal, unvarnished logic of the North was strange to her, but it was undeniably effective. She let her hand drop from her neck. "Thank you," Daenerys said, her voice sincere. "Thank you for striking me." Jon blinked, entirely unused to receiving gratitude for a kidnapping, but he offered a small, respectful tilt of his head in return. Daenerys turned to walk toward the wooden railing of the ship. She looked out over the vast, churning expanse of the sea. The sprawling, treacherous cities of Essos were far behind them, lost beyond the eastern horizon. Ahead lay nothing but the endless blue of the sky meeting the water. "Where are we going?" Daenerys asked, pulling the heavy wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Arthur Dayne stepped up beside her, his gaze fixed firmly on the western horizon. "To Westeros, Princess," Arthur answered softly. "We are sailing to Sea Dragon Point, to the north." Daenerys took a deep breath of the freezing, salty air. She had been running for 17 years across a foreign continent, moving from manse to manse, living entirely on the charity of men who wished to use her. She had never seen the shores of the kingdom she was born to. She looked at the gray waves, the lingering fear in her chest finally dissolving into a quiet, profound sense of peace. She was going home. While the Winter's Lance cut silently toward the safety of the north, The sprawling, opulent manse of Magister Illyrio Mopatus in Pentos was descending into absolute chaos. The morning had begun with the horrific discovery in the western wing. Viserys Targaryen stood in the center of his sister's bedchamber, his pale face flushed with an ugly, terrifying shade of crimson. The room was perfectly pristine. There were no signs of a struggle. The silk sheets on the massive bed had not been slept in. The heavy oak door was unlocked. But Daenerys was gone, and the small bundle of her meager possessions was missing. "Where is she?" Viserys screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical rage. He grabbed a delicate Myrish vase from a side table and hurled it violently against the marble floor, shattering it into 100 pieces. Magister Illyrio stood in the doorway, his massive bulk blocking the exit. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his thick neck with a scented silk handkerchief. Beside him stood the captain of his guard, looking pale and terrified. "Your Grace, please calm yourself," Illyrio urged, though his buttery voice trembled slightly. "The guards are searching the grounds. She cannot have gone far. A young girl does not simply vanish into thin air." "She didn't vanish," Viserys spat, marching across the room to point a trembling finger directly at the Magister's chest. "She was stolen. The usurper's assassins have breached your walls. Illyrio, they took her in the night." "Impossible," the captain of the guard stammered, shaking his head frantically. "The gates were sealed. The Unsullied did not move from their posts. We found no ropes on the walls, no forced locks, no tracks in the gardens. Mero and Vario were patrolling the rear wall all night." "And what did they see?" Viserys demanded, his violet eyes wide and manic. The captain swallowed hard. They claim they saw a ghost, Your Grace. They said the wine barrels moved on their own, and their silver was stolen by an invisible spirit." Viserys stared at the captain for 3 seconds of absolute, stunned silence. Then, he backhanded the man across the face so hard the captain stumbled into the doorframe. "Ghosts!" Viserys shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "You guard my sister with drunken fools who chase shadows while the usurper's men steal my army?" Viserys turned back to Illyrio, his paranoia twisting into full-blown madness. "Or perhaps it wasn't the usurper at all. Perhaps it was you. You sold her to another magister. You took my bride and hid her away to cheat me of my crown. Your Grace, I assure you, I have no part in this," Illyrio protested, his heart hammering in his chest as the true, horrifying reality of their situation dawned on him. He didn't care about Viserys' wild accusations. He cared about the rising sun. "Your Grace, listen to me," Illyrio said, dropping the formal titles as panic set in. "Khal Drogo will be at my gates before the sun reaches its peak. He is coming with 40,000 men to claim the bride I promised him." Viserys froze, the screaming dying in his throat as the words registered. "If we do not produce the silver-haired princess when he arrives," Illyrio continued, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper, "the Khal will not ask for explanations. He will not care about ghosts or assassins. He will assume we have insulted his honor." Illyrio looked around the empty room, wiping the sweat from his brow. "If she is not found within the hour, Viserys," the Magister said grimly, "the Dothraki will burn this manse to the ground, and they will drag both of us behind their horses until there is nothing left but bloody bone." Viserys looked at the open window, then at the shattered vase on the floor. The grand, glorious vision of his return to Westeros crumbled into dust, replaced instantly by the terrifying image of a Dothraki Iraq. The Beggar King did not attempt to rally the guards. He did not formulate a plan to search the city. He simply pushed past the Magister and began to run down the marble corridor, intent only on reaching the stables before the drumming of hooves announced the arrival of the horde. Chapter 118, The Wolf and the Dragon. The morning of the wedding broke clear and agonizingly cold. For the first time in many moons, the courtyard of Winterfell was not filled with the harsh ringing of hammers on anvils or the steady, rhythmic tramp of marching boots. The forges still burned, but the great host of the north had set aside their armor for the day. They had crushed the southern zealots in the mud of the neck, and the true war against the dead still waited in the deep snows beyond the wall. Sandwiched between these two brutal realities, Eddard Stark had decreed a day of celebration. The North needed to remember what they were fighting to protect. In the high chambers of the Great Keep, the preparations were quiet and deliberate, though the presence of the southern guests added a vibrant warmth to the stone room. The banners of Starfall and Sunspear flew proudly in the courtyard below. Ashara's kin from House Dane also came mingling seamlessly with the formidable retinue of Dorne. Elia Martell stood behind her daughter, her dark eyes looking into the polished silver glass. 17 years ago, Elia had been a prisoner in the Red Keep, waiting for the mountain to batter down her door. She had expected to die holding her children in the dark. Instead, the Lord of Winterfell had broken down the door, slaughtered the monsters of the south, and brought them to the freezing safety of the north. Now, her daughter was preparing to marry the heir to that very kingdom. "Hold still, Rhaenys," Elia murmured, her hands deftly weaving a thick braid of dark hair. "If you move, the pins will not hold." "I am perfectly still, mother," Rhaenys replied, though a faint, nervous energy betrayed her usual calm. Ashara Stark stood nearby, overseeing the final adjustments to the gown. Rhaenys did not wear the light, flowing silks of Dorne, nor did she wear the severe, unadorned wool of a standard northern bride. Her dress was a flawless, pragmatic blend of her heritage and her future. It was fashioned from heavy, deep crimson silk that caught the light like dark fire, lined on the inside with thick, insulating black wolf fur. The bodice was tailored tightly, practical and unrestrictive, with long sleeves that ended in dark gray leather cuffs. Pinned to her right shoulder was a small, finely wrought silver clasp depicting a sun pierced by a spear. On her left, a three-headed dragon. Ashara stepped forward, handing Rhaenys a heavy cloak. It was the maiden's cloak, the garment that represented the protection of her father's house. It was divided perfectly down the middle, one half the bright orange of House Martell, the other the stark black and red of House Targaryen. "You look beautiful, Rhaenys," Ashara said quietly, her violet eyes softening with genuine affection. "I look like a target in the snow," Rhaenys noted dryly, looking at the vibrant colors of the cloak. "You are marrying the heir to Winterfell," Ashara countered, offering a rare, faint smile. "No man in the Seven Kingdoms would dare aim an arrow at you now. And if they did, Cregan would break their spine over his knee." Elia rested her hands on her daughter's shoulders. "You are safe here, my sweet bird. You have always been safe here. Today we simply make it permanent." The heavy oak door to the chambers swung open, admitting a sudden burst of southern energy. Prince Oberyn Martell strode into the room, draped in flowing robes of burnt orange and red silk that stood in stark contrast to the thick northern furs. Beside him walked his paramour, Ilaria Sand, and close behind them trailed his eldest daughters, Obara, Nymeria, and Tyene. "Safe and radiant," Oberyn declared, crossing the room to kiss his sister Elia firmly on the cheek. He stepped back, looking at his niece with a fierce, proud smile. "You look like a true dragon, Rhaenys. The wolves will not know what to do with you. They will learn, uncle," Rhaenys replied smoothly, a fond smile breaking through her nervous energy. Ilaria stepped forward, taking Rhaenys' hands in her own. "May the sun warm your path today, little bird," she murmured warmly. As Elia and Ashara pulled Oberyn and Ilaria aside to discuss the seating arrangements for the feast, the sand snakes smoothly flanked their cousin. Obara, wearing soft leather rather than her usual armor, crossed her arms and offered a rare, approving nod. Nymeria leaned in close, her dark eyes gleaming with mischief. "You are exceptionally lucky, cousin," Nymeria noted in a low, teasing whisper. "The Wolf Lord is dangerously handsome for a man raised in the snow. Broad shoulders, good hands." Tyene smiled sweetly, resting her chin on her hand. "Once the winter settles in, and the castle gets terribly cold, will you share him with us?" Rhaenys shot her cousins a sharp, playful glare. She did not answer the question, offering only a cryptic, dangerous little smile. She was Dornish, after all, and the bounds of marriage in the Deep South were far more fluid than the rigid traditions of the snow. Across the keep, in the heavy stone chambers of the air, the mood was entirely devoid of sentimentality. Cregan Stark stood in the center of the room, his broad chest expanding as he pulled on a pristine, tailored tunic of dark gray wool. The garment was simple, bearing no intricate embroidery, save for the snarling direwolf of House Stark stamped into the heavy iron clasps of his sword belt. The heavy oak door opened, and Benjen Stark walked in, clapping his hands together to ward off the cold. "You look stiff," Benjen observed cheerfully, leaning against the stone doorframe. "You are standing as if you expect Halder to swing a blunted sword at your ribs." "I would rather face Halder," Cregan muttered, adjusting his heavy leather cuffs. "A wooden sword I can block," Hundreds of lords staring at me while I recite ancient vows before a tree is a different matter. The yard is full, Benjen continued, stepping fully into the room. The great John has already started drinking, and Roose Bolton is standing by the armory looking like someone stole his favorite flaying knife. It is a perfect day for a wedding. Benjen looked his nephew up and down, nodding in approval. You clean up decently, Cregan. But if you were a wildling, you wouldn't have to deal with the ceremony. You would just find the girl, throw her over your shoulder, and carry her off into the woods. Rhaenys carries a spear, uncle, Cregan pointed out dryly. If I tried to throw her over my shoulder without asking, she would likely stab me in the kidney. A fair point, Benjen conceded with a grin. The smile faded slightly as the Lord of Sea Dragon Point grew solemn. The northern lords respect you, Cregan, but today they see you claim a dragon. Stand tall. Benjen clapped a heavy hand on Cregan's shoulder. It is time. Cregan took a deep breath, nodding. He strapped his sword belt around his waist, not out of fear of an attack, but because a Stark did not stand before the old gods without his steel. The procession to the Godswood was orderly and quiet. The snow had been packed hard under the boots of thousands of men over the past few weeks, creating a solid path through the main courtyard. The High Lords of the North stood waiting at the entrance to the ancient, walled forest. Eddard Stark stood at the front, his heavy direwolf pelt draped over his shoulders. He gave his son a single, firm nod as Cregan approached. Stand by the water, Cregan, Ned instructed quietly. Cregan walked deep into the Godswood. The air here was perfectly still, the biting wind blocked by the dense, towering canopy of sentinel pines and ironwoods. Thick, warm mist rolled off the black pool of the hot springs, creating a heavy, dreamlike atmosphere that smelled of damp earth and ancient sap. He stopped before the massive, bone-white trunk of the heart tree. The carved face in the weirwood bark wept its dark red sap, staring blindly out over the water. The presence of the old gods was a palpable weight in the air, a deep, silent hum in the force that Cregan felt vibrating in his very bones. The lords filed in behind him, filling the cleared spaces among the roots. They did not speak. The rustling of wool and the crunch of snow were the only sounds. Then the crowd parted. Rhaenys Targaryen walked through the ancient trees. With her sworn shield Arthur Dayne sailing the narrow sea on a covert extraction, she was escorted by her mother. Elia Martell walked beside her daughter with a rigid, flawless dignity, a princess of Dorne offering her child to the guardians of the north. From the thick, warm mist of the hot springs, a massive shape emerged. Frost, Cregan's heavy-set gray direwolf, padded silently to the edge of the black pool. The beast was already the size of a pony, his thick fur slick with the damp air. He did not growl or bare his teeth. He simply sat on his haunches beside the weirwood, his intelligent eyes fixed unblinking upon Rhaenys. The lords in the crowd stiffened, but Rhaenys did not flinch. She looked radiant. The deep crimson silk and black fur stood out sharply against the pure white snow and the pale bark of the weirwood. The thick mist curled around the hem of her skirts as she approached the black pool, stopping just a pace away from Cregan. Ned Stark stepped forward, taking his place beside the heart tree. He looked at Elia. Who comes before the old gods this night? Ned's voice resonated through the quiet wood, heavy and absolute. Rhaenys of House Targaryen and House Martell. Elia Martell answered clearly, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent grove. A woman grown, trueborn, and noble. She comes to beg the blessings of the gods. Who comes to claim her? Cregan stepped forward, his boots crunching on the frost. He looked directly into Rhaenys' dark eyes. Cregan of House Stark, he answered, his voice deep and unshaken. Heir to Winterfell and Warden of the North. Who gives her? Elia of House Martell, she replied. Her mother, who carried her through the fire. Elia turned to Rhaenys, offering her daughter a slight, deeply respectful kiss on the cheek, before stepping back into the crowd, leaving the bride and groom alone before the tree. Lady Rhaenys, Ned addressed her, his tone softening slightly. Will you take this man? Rhaenys did not look at Ned. She kept her eyes locked on Cregan. In the south, a princess was expected to look demure, to lower her eyes and offer a fragile whisper of consent. Rhaenys did no such thing. Her gaze was fierce, unyielding, and completely certain. I take this man, Rhaenys said, her voice ringing clearly through the freezing air. Cregan stepped completely into her space. He reached out with steady hands and unclasped the silver pins holding the maiden's cloak. He lifted the heavy garment of red, black, and orange from her shoulders, handing it back to Elia. From his own shoulders, Cregan unfastened a heavy cloak of pure white wool, adorned with a massive gray direwolf. He draped it carefully over Rhaenys, fastening the iron clasp tight against her collarbone. The physical weight of the heavy fur settled heavily upon her shoulders, pulling her firmly under the absolute protection of his house. "I am hers and she is mine." Cregan spoke the ancient vow, his voice low and firm. "From this day until the end of my days. I am his and he is mine," Rhaenys answered, her dark eyes reflecting the pale face of the weirwood behind him. "From this day until the end of my days." Beside the pool, Frost lowered his massive head. The direwolf did not howl. He simply let out a deep, rumbling chuff that vibrated through the damp earth, the ancient magic of the pack formally claiming the dragon. They knelt together in the snow before the weeping face of the tree. They bowed their heads in silence. There were no long sermons. There were no choirs singing hymns to the seven. There was only the cold wind in the branches and the slow bubbling of the hot springs. After a long moment, Cregan stood. He offered his hand to Rhaenys. She took it, pulling herself up. Cregan leaned down and kissed her. It was not the desperate, bruising kiss of their private chambers, but a firm, solid promise made before the lords of the north. When they broke apart, the great Jon could hold his silence no longer. The massive lord of the last hearth let out a booming cheer, raising a massive fist into the air. The other lords immediately joined the roar, the sound echoing through the ancient trees, startling a flock of ravens into the gray sky. The quiet reverence of the godswood was instantly replaced by the roaring fires and deafening noise of the great hall. The feast was monumental. The long oak tables groaned under the weight of roasted aurochs, massive trenchers of root vegetables, thick wheels of dark bread, and roasted mutton. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and spilled ale. The bards did not play delicate southern lutes or sing high, weeping songs of chivalry. They pounded heavy skin drums and played rough, fast-paced tunes on wooden pipes, the music designed to be heard over the shouting of hundreds of drunken men. At the high table, Cregan and Rhaenys sat in the center. Rhaenys picked at a piece of roasted meat, her dark eyes scanning the hall. Lords are exceptionally loud when they are not preparing to kill someone. They have spent the last few moons building pyres and bracing for war, Cregan noted, taking a long drink of dark ale from his horn. "Let them shout. Keeps the cold out." Down on the main floor, the clash of cultures was already in full effect. Obara Sand, having discarded her formal silks for comfortable leather, was seated squarely among the towering men of House Umber. The great Jon, assuming the fierce Dornish woman possessed a fragile southern palate, slid a massive, sloshing horn of northern fire across the table toward her. "Careful, snake," the giant rumbled with a wicked grin. "That's not your sweet plum wine. It puts hair on a man's chest." Obara did not hesitate. She picked up the heavy horn and downed the high-proof, peat-smoked spirit in 3 long, unbroken swallows. She didn't cough and her eyes didn't water. She simply slammed the empty horn back onto the wood, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and pushed it back toward the great Jon. "Pour another, bear," Obara demanded smoothly. "I'm still thirsty." The great Jon stared at the empty horn, then at the unblinking Dornish woman. A massive, delighted boom of laughter erupted from his chest as he eagerly reached for the cask. At a neighboring table, William Dustin and Ricard Karstark were quietly discussing the grueling task of moving heavy horse through the mud of the neck during the recent conflict, keeping their minds firmly anchored on the defense of the realm even amidst the celebration. As the hours dragged on, the barrels of winter's breath and northern fire were tapped. The high-proof spirits hit the blood of the lords, turning the loud celebration into a rowdy, unstable brawl of good cheer. Before the chaos could fully descend, the great Jon wiped his ale-soaked beard and marched heavily toward the high table, dragging something massive behind him. The lord of the last hearth stopped before Cregan and Rhaenys, dropping his burden onto the stone floor with a heavy thud. It was a massive, incredibly thick snowbear pelt, the terrifying, fanged head of the beast still firmly attached to the hide. "My wedding gift to the bride and groom," the great Jon roared proudly over the music. "Killed it myself in the deep pines. It's for the nursery floor, good for keeping the bairns warm, and it scares the hounds away." Rhaenys looked at the massive, glassy eyes of the dead bear. She blinked, entirely unused to receiving severed animal heads as tokens of affection, but she quickly recovered her poise. "It is a magnificent pelt, Lord Umber. You honor us." Cregan took a long drink of his ale to mask his smirk, thoroughly enjoying the sheer absurdity of presenting a stuffed bear head for a nursery. "We thank you, Lord Umber." Wyman Manderley's face was flushed a deep, violent red as he watched the exchange. Suddenly, a loud, slurred voice cut through the music from the Karstark benches. "The betting!" shouted a drunken lord, slamming his heavy tankard repeatedly against the wood. "To the betting!" The call was immediately taken up by a dozen other men. "The betting! Carry them up!" The music stopped. The Great John hopped down from the dais, grinning wickedly as he cracked his massive knuckles. The tradition was ancient and entirely lacking in dignity. The men of the hall would grab the bride, carrying her to the bedchamber while tearing away her clothes, shouting bawdy jokes. The women would do the same to the groom. It was a chaotic, invasive ritual that the North adhered to with stubborn pride. Scores of drunken lords and knights began to surge forward from the lower tables, their eyes fixed firmly on the high table. Rhaenys stiffened, her hand instinctively dropping to the table, searching for a knife that wasn't there. The idea of dozens of strange, drunken men grabbing at her and tearing her dress sent a sharp spike of anger and panic into her chest. Cregan felt the shift in her presence immediately. He looked at the approaching mob of drunken lords. He looked at his father, Ned, who was sitting back in his chair with a faint, amused smile, clearly intending to let the tradition play out. Cregan did not share his father's amusement. He was not about to let half the Northern Army put their hands on his wife. "Hold on," Cregan muttered to Rhaenys. Before Rhaenys could ask what he meant, Cregan stood up. He moved with the sudden, explosive speed drilled into him by a lifetime of training. He reached down, hooked one arm behind Rhaenys' knees, and the other around her back. In a single, fluid motion, he swept her out of her chair and hoisted her high against his chest in a secure, tight hold. Rhaenys let out a startled gasp, dropping her wine goblet. It clattered loudly onto the wooden table. "Hey!" the Great John shouted, pointing a massive sausage-thick finger at the air. "Put her down, lad. It's tradition. We have to carry her. Find another bride to carry, Umber." Cregan shouted back, his voice booming over the crowd. Cregan didn't wait for a response. He turned and bolted. He moved swiftly around the heavy oak of the high table, planting his boots firmly on the stone floor of the main hall, completely bypassing the steps of the dais. Rhaenys grabbed him tightly around the neck to secure herself as he hit the ground running. "Stop him!" William Dustin laughed, lunging forward to grab Cregan's cloak. Cregan let his years of training take over. He ducked beneath Dustin's grasping hand, sidestepped a stumbling guardsman, and broke into a dead sprint down the center aisle of the Great Hall. The room erupted into absolute chaos. "Get him!" Roose Bolton's heir shouted, joining the pursuit. /N. Domeric Bolton is alive as Ramsay Snow was killed by wolf pack members when they were patrolling all over North looking for bandits. He was on one of his hunting spree with his dogs and the wolf pack members killed him for his cruelty. Roose Bolton didn't even acknowledge his existence. Dozens of lords and guardsmen scrambled over benches and tables, trying to cut off the heir's escape. It was a mass, drunken stampede. Cregan moved like a ghost through the timber forest of the hall. He ducked a flailing arm, spun past a falling chair, and accelerated. He carried Rhaenys' weight as if she were made of feathers. His heavy boots thudded loudly against the stone, effortlessly outpacing the drunken mob behind him. Rhaenys, realizing exactly what he was doing, threw her head back and let out a bright, ringing laugh. "Run, you heavy fool. They're catching up. They couldn't catch me if I was carrying a horse." Cregan shot back, dodging a flying loaf of bread thrown by a frustrated Karstark spearman. He reached the heavy double doors at the back of the hall. He didn't slow down to push them open. He simply hit the wood with his shoulder, blasting the heavy doors wide open and spilling out into the freezing night air of the courtyard. "Close the doors!" Cregan yelled at the two stunned wolf guards standing watch outside. The guards blinked, saw the massive mob of drunken lords surging down the aisle behind the heir, and immediately grabbed the heavy iron rings, slamming the oak doors shut and dropping the crossbar just as the Great John slammed into the wood from the inside. The heavy thud of the giant hitting the door echoed in the courtyard, followed by a muffled string of curses. Cregan didn't stop. He carried Rhaenys rapidly across the snow-covered yard, making a direct line for the Great Keep. He took the stone stairs two at a time, his focus entirely on reaching the safety of their chambers. He navigated the quiet corridors, bypassing the baffled night watchman, until he reached his heavy oak door. He kicked the door open, stepped inside, and kicked it shut behind him. He reached over with his free hand and slammed the heavy iron deadbolt into place with a resounding clack. Cregan leaned his back against the heavy wood, his chest heaving as the heat of the sprint slowly faded. He looked down. Rhaenys was still held securely against his chest. Her dark hair had fallen out of its perfect braid, framing her face in wild curls. She was looking up at him, her dark eyes shining with pure, unadulterated amusement. "You robbed them of their tradition," Rhaenys teased, her arms still wrapped loosely around his neck. "Your lords are going to be deeply offended." "They will survive," Cregan said, his breathing steadying. He looked at the heavy silk and fur of her dress, completely untouched and untorn. "No one touches you but me." Rhaenys' smile softened into something darker, heavier. She let her legs drop to the floor, sliding down his body until her boots hit the stone, though she did not step away. She reached up, resting her palms flat against his chest. "Then I suggest you stop standing by the door," Rhaenys murmured, her voice dropping to a quiet, demanding whisper. Cregan didn't argue. He reached for the heavy iron clasp of the Stark cloak resting on her shoulders, leaving the drunken lords and the cold of the north firmly locked outside. Chapter 119, The Poison Water. The voyage from the eastern shores of Essos to the western coast of the north was a grueling, arduous journey. The Winter's Lance had slipped out of Pentos in the dead of night, sailing south through the narrow sea, navigating the treacherous currents of the Stepstones, and charting a wide course around the blistering coasts of Dorne. They had bypassed the arbor and sailed straight up the Sunset Sea, keeping well away from the shipping lanes of the Westerlands and the raiding waters of the Iron Islands. It took moons, but the sleek northern carrack finally cut through the freezing, gray swells of the northern coast. Standing near the bow of the ship, wrapped in a heavy cloak of dark gray wool, stood a girl who no longer looked like a Targaryen princess. Her striking, silver-blonde hair was gone. The morning after her extraction from the Magister's Manse, Anna had brought a bowl of crushed walnut husks, ash, and dark northern dyes into the cabin. The process had been quiet and thorough. Now, the girl's hair was the color of a raven's wing, matching the dark, unremarkable coloring of a common northern maid. They did not call her Daenerys anymore. The name was too dangerous, too steeped in the blood of the South. From the moment the dye set, they called her Dany. Dany touched the ends of her dark hair, the cold wind whipping the strands across her face. She felt strange, looking into the polished silver glass in the cabin and seeing a stranger. But the strange reflection brought an undeniable sense of safety. The beggar king's sister was gone. The usurper's assassins would not look twice at a dark-haired girl in a woolen cloak. "The wind is biting today," a quiet voice said beside her. Dany turned. Jon Stark stepped up to the railing, his own gray cloak pulled tight. He did not hover or crowd her, maintaining a respectful, quiet distance. Over the long weeks at sea, Dany had watched Jon closely. Viserys had commanded obedience through frantic screams, threats, and physical abuse, demanding respect he had never earned. Jon rarely spoke above a quiet murmur. Yet, when the young wolf simply nodded his head, the hardened, scarred sailors of the Northern Fleet moved with seamless, absolute purpose. True power, Dany realized with quiet awe, does not need to shout. "I do not mind the cold," Dany answered softly, looking out at the rocky, imposing coastline emerging from the sea mist. She took a deep breath. In Pentos, the air had always felt thick, smelling heavily of roasted spices, cheap perfumes, and the rotting garbage of the lower canals. The air blowing off the northern coast was entirely different. It smelled of sharp sea salt, fresh pine needles, and the faint, distant tang of hot iron from the forges. It was a hard, honest smell, completely devoid of the treacherous poisons of the free cities. "The north is vast," Jon told her, his gray eyes fixed on the approaching land. "There is plenty of room to breathe." Rising from the rocky cliffs was a formidable, dark stone keep. It lacked the towering, massive scale of Winterfell, but it was undeniably strong. Heavy breakwaters of cut basalt extended into the ocean, creating a calm, deep-water harbor. Dozens of northern warships rode at anchor, their ironwood hulls dark and lethal against the gray water. "Sea Dragon Point," Arthur Dayne confirmed, stepping out of the captain's cabin. He rolled his shoulders, eager to feel solid ground beneath his boots after moons at sea. Lord Benjen's seat. It is the shield of the western coast. The Winter's Lance glided smoothly into the harbor, the crew working the rigging with their usual silent efficiency. The heavy iron anchors were dropped, and the gangplank was lowered onto the stone piers. A contingent of guards wearing the blue direwolf sigil over dark-boiled leather marched down the docks to meet them. At their head was a broad-shouldered, weathered man with a thick gray beard and a scarred cheek. Arthur Dane walked down the gangplank first, followed closely by Anna, Jon, and Dany. Sir Arthur, the master-at-arms of Sea Dragon Point greeted, offering a deep, respectful bow. Lady Anna, we had word from the watchtowers that a northern ship was approaching, though we did not expect the Winter's Lance. It was a long voyage, Captain, Arthur said smoothly, offering a brief nod. He looked around the bustling, disciplined courtyard of the keep, frowning slightly. Where is the young wolf maid? Anna sighed, rubbing her temples. She slipped away the moment the anchor dropped. I imagine she is currently trying to scale the outer wall of the armory. The master-at-arms blinked in confusion, but Arthur simply shook his head. Leave her be. Is Lord Benjen within the castle? He is not, sir, the master-at-arms replied. Lord Benjen and his family departed for Winterfell. They rode east to attend the wedding of the young Lord Cregan to the Princess Rhaenys. When did they ride? Anna asked quietly. It has been half a moon, my lady, the master-at-arms answered. The wedding has likely already come and passed. Lord Benjen left strict orders before his departure. The master-at-arms continued, gesturing toward the heavy ironwood gates of the keep. He said if the Winter's Lance dropped anchor, the keep was yours. The hearths are lit in the guest wings, and the baths are drawn. The rooms are prepared for you all, my lord. The small party followed the master-at-arms up the stone steps and into the heavy, warming embrace of Sea Dragon Point. Dany walked closely beside Jon, her dark eyes taking in the unadorned, brutal strength of the northern architecture. There were no delicate silk tapestries or golden statues here. The walls were thick block stone, the doors were banded with heavy iron, and the hearths roared with massive pine logs. It was a fortress built to survive the end of the world. She was shown to a modest, warm chamber. There was a simple wooden bed draped in thick wolf furs, a wash basin of steaming hot water, and a small window looking out over the sunset sea. Anna stepped into the room behind her, carrying a bundle of heavy garments. She dropped them onto the bed. Wash the salt from your skin, Dany, Anna instructed. The kitchens will bring hot stew and fresh bread shortly. Anna picked up the fine, purple Pentos silk gown Dany had worn since the manse, turning it over in her calloused hands with clear disdain. Without a word of warning, the northern woman tossed the expensive silk directly into the roaring hearth fire, caught instantly, curling into black ash. Dany gasped, stepping back. Silk does not stop the wind, and it does not stop a blade, Anna said plainly. She pointed to the bundle on the bed. Put those on. Dany looked at the burning dress. It was the garment Illyrio had wrapped her in to sell her to a warlord. She did not look away, nor did she mourn it. Dany stepped forward, picked up a heavy iron hearth poker, and deliberately shoved the expensive fabric deeper into the roaring flames until there was nothing left but gray cinder. She turned to the bed. There were thick, dark wool trousers, a heavy linen tunic, a boiled leather jerkin, and a cloak lined with dense bear fur. She pulled the garments on. They were rough, stiff, and lacked any intricate embroidery. Yet, as she fastened the heavy iron clasp of the cloak, Dany felt a profound shift. She physically felt the heavy, unglamorous weight of northern survival settling over her shoulders. It did not feel like a cage. It felt like armor. You all missed a wedding, Dany murmured softly, her hands resting on the edge of the thick wool cloak. Because of me, Jon missed his brother's vows. Jon knew the cost of the journey before he climbed over the wall in Pentos, Anna replied firmly, her gray eyes brooking no argument. The North protects its own, Dany, and you are under our roof now. Do not carry guilt for the time it took to bring you out of the fire. Thousands of leagues to the east, the sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty, sprawling flatlands of Essos, where safety was a concept entirely unknown to Viserys Targaryen. The relentless, rhythmic thudding of horses created a suffocating cloud of brown dust that choked the air and coated the throat in grit. Viserys sat slumped in the back of a crude, violently shaking wooden wagon, his wrists bound tightly with coarse rope. His fine silk clothes were torn to rags, stained with mud, sweat, and dried blood. His silver-blonde hair was matted with filth. His face was a mask of blistered, peeling sunburns. He was no longer a king in exile. He was a prisoner of the horde. Across from him in the wagon, Magister Illyrio Mopatis looked even worse. The massive, wealthy merchant of Pentos had lost a staggering amount of weight in a moon. His buttery, perfumed skin hung loosely on his frame, his expensive rings slipping from his shrinking fingers. Every time the wagon hit a rut in the baked earth, Illyrio let out a low, miserable groan. Viserys squeezed his eyes shut. Despite the harsh reality of the ropes cutting into his wrists, his mind refused to accept his captivity. His pride had twisted into pure, unadulterated madness. He stared blindly through the dust at the great host of riders ahead. "You see, Magister?" Viserys rasped, his voice a hoarse, broken croak, his cracked lips pulling into a terrifying, delusional smile. "The call finally understands his place. He marches to the sea for me. He forces his savages to the water out of devotion to their true king." Illyrio simply squeezed his eyes shut, wishing the beggar king would choke on his own delusions. Drogo was not marching for the throne of Westeros. Drogo was marching for blood. Illyrio remembered the morning Khal Drogo had arrived at the manse to claim his bride. The heavy cedar doors of the receiving hall had been pushed open. Drogo was a mountain of copper skin and heavy muscle, his long, braided hair swinging with the heavy chime of silver bells. Through Illyrio's frantic translations, Drogo had demanded his silver queen. Viserys, terrified and desperate, had pointed a trembling finger toward the sea. "She is missing, stolen in the night. The usurper, Robert Baratheon, sent assassins over your walls. They took my sister." Drogo had not yelled. He had stared at Viserys with eyes as cold and dark as polished obsidian. Promised gift had been stolen. In his mounting panic, Viserys had made a fatal error. He had challenged the warlord's pride. "The usurper stole her because he knows you fear the poison water," Viserys had screamed, spit flying from his lips. "He laughs in his stone keep because he knows the great Khal is too afraid to get his horses wet. He mocks your strength." To a Khal, strength was absolute. An insult of cowardice could not be answered with a shrug. The warlord had spoken a single, harsh command in his native tongue. The Blood Riders moved with terrifying, explosive violence. A Blood Rider had backhanded Viserys across the face with a heavy leather gauntlet, shattering his nose and dropping him to the marble floor in a spray of blood. The horde had begun to strip the manse. As Viserys lay bleeding on the stones, Illyrio had wept, begging for his life. Illyrio was a survivor. When Drogo drew his arak, demanding the heads of the men who had brokered a false deal, Illyrio had used his only remaining weapon, his hidden wealth. "I will buy you the wooden horses," Illyrio had shrieked in broken Dothraki, pressing his fat face to the marble floor. "The sea is wide, great Khal. I will hire the Volantene galleys. They are built for beasts. I will buy you the passage to claim your vengeance." Drogo had lowered his blade. He was not a sailor, and his men feared the water. If the fat merchant could provide the massive, stable ships needed to ferry warhorses, his life would be spared until the shores of Westeros were reached. A brutal bump in the road snapped Viserys back to the agonizing present. He coughed, spitting a mouthful of gritty dust onto the wooden floorboards of the wagon. The heat of the Essosi Plains was absolute. The Dothraki horde had not turned east, back toward the vast, empty plains of their homeland. For moons, they had been marching steadily, relentlessly westward. They were marching toward the coast. Khal Drogo rode at the very front of the massive column, his great red stallion stepping easily over the baked earth. He did not look back at his captives. His dark, unyielding gaze was fixed firmly on the horizon. For thousands of years, the Dothraki had adhered to a strict, unbreakable superstition. They feared the ocean. They called it the poison water. A horse could not drink it, and a horse could not ride upon it. But Drogo would not allow the men in iron to steal from him and hide behind their poison water. A khalasar of 40,000 men, with its women, children, and massive herds of sheep, could never cross the ocean. Drogo had known this. In a rare display of pragmatic strategy, the warlord had split his host. He left the women, the elders, and the vast herds behind on the flatlands under the guard of his lesser Khos. He had taken only his vanguard, 15,000 hardened, lethal riders, unburdened by wagons or slaves. 2 days later, the smell of dust and dry grass gave way to the heavy, pungent stench of salt and fish. The vanguard crested a high ridge, looking down upon a sprawling, walled port city on the western coast of Essos. The warning bells in the city towers began to ring frantically as the citizens saw the endless tide of riders pouring over the hills. The city guards scrambled to the walls, hauling up heavy crossbows and bolting the thick wooden gates. Khal Drogo rode forward, raising his heavy arak, preparing to command his riders to crash against the stone walls and bleed the city dry. "Great Khal, wait," Illyrio begged, practically tumbling out of his wooden cart. He scrambled through the dust, falling to his knees before Drogo's red stallion. "Your riders will die against those walls. A siege will take moons. Let me speak to the magisters. I can buy the gates for you." Drogo lowered his arak a fraction of an inch, his dark eyes assessing the merchant. He gave a single, sharp nod. Illyrio rode forward under a hastily rigged banner of peace. He stood beneath the high stone walls and shouted up to the terrified guards. He demanded to speak to the ruling factors of the city. When they appeared, Illyrio did not threaten them with Dothraki steel. He threatened them with his own staggering wealth. He promised them a fortune in pure gold from his hidden reserves, enough to buy the entire city twice over, if they would simply open the gates and allow the horse lords access to the harbor. Faced with the choice between a brutal, bloody slaughter and immense wealth, the magisters chose the gold. The heavy wooden gates groaned open without a single drop of blood spilled. The Dothraki rode through the city streets, a terrifying river of muscle and steel. They ignored the terrified citizens and rowed directly to the deep water piers of the harbor. Waiting in the water, secured by Illyrio's urgent ravens weeks prior, was a massive fleet of Volantene slave galleys. They were enormous, hulking vessels with deep hulls and banks of heavy oars. Drogo dismounted at the edge of the pier, staring out at the dark, rolling waves of the narrow sea. The water was alien, cold, and tasted of salt on the wind. His blood riders dismounted behind him, their faces marked with deep, instinctual unease as they looked at the poison water. Illyrio rushed to the Khal's side, bowing low. "The ships are vast, great Khal," Illyrio said carefully, choosing his words to avoid inciting anger. "But horses are not slaves. They will panic in the dark hold. To build the proper wooden stalls, to gather enough grain, fodder, and fresh water to sustain 15,000 riders and their mounts across the sea, it will take time." Drogo turned his obsidian gaze upon the merchant. "It will take at least 5 moons, great Khal," Illyrio finished, his voice trembling slightly. Drogo looked at the vast fleet, then at his uneasy blood riders. He knew the merchant spoke the truth. To sail immediately was to invite death by starvation and madness on the open water. He gave a sharp, consenting nod. The preparations would be made. But the Khal would not allow his men to succumb to their fear of the sea during the long wait. Drogo turned his back on the merchant. He walked to his massive red stallion, grasped the reins firmly in one hand, and marched straight up the steep, narrow wooden ramp of the nearest moored galley. The horse shrieked, its hooves clattering wildly against the hollow wood, but the sheer, absolute willpower of the Khal forced the beast forward until they both stood upon the deck of the ship. Drogo turned back to face the docks, standing tall against the sea wind, showing his men that the poison water was merely another land for him to conquer. Back in the safety of Sea Dragon Point, miles across the ocean, the sun broke through the gray clouds, casting a pale light over the training yard. Jon Stark stood in the center of the yard, his wooden practice sword raised. Across from him, Arthur Dayne moved with fluid, lethal grace, parrying Jon's strikes with casual precision. From the balcony overlooking the yard, Dany watched them spar. The heavy wool and bare fur kept the biting coastal wind at bay, allowing her to lean comfortably against the cold stone. She watched the unyielding discipline of the Northmen, feeling a quiet, steady rhythm returning to her life. Below in the yard, Arthur Dayne deflected a thrust from Jon, stepping back to reset his stance. The Sword of the Morning did not look at Jon. His violet eyes shifted upward, resting quietly on the dark-haired girl on the balcony. Arthur had served King Aerys. He knew the jagged, erratic tremor of the Mad King's blood better than any man alive. Over the long voyage, and now in the quiet of the keep, he had watched the last Targaryen princess closely. He searched her quiet demeanor and her steady hands for any sign of the rot that had destroyed her family. Arthur lowered his wooden sword, a faint, deeply relieved breath escaping his lips. There was no madness there. He found only a resilient, cautious survivor, finally finding her footing in the snow. Jon lowered his own practice blade, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. He nodded his thanks to his mentor, resting the wooden sword against the weapon rack. Jon walked to the edge of the training yard, stopping near the heavy stone wall. He closed his eyes. The ambient sounds of the coastal keep, the crashing of the waves against the breakwaters, the ringing of a distant hammer, slowly faded away. Jon sank deep into the force, letting his awareness expand outward. He bypassed the local forests and the immediate shoreline, casting his mind hundreds of leagues to the east, tracing the ancient, familiar tether of his ward bond. Thousands of miles away, within the walls of Winterfell, he found the brilliant, pristine spark of Ghost. Jon's vision shifted seamlessly. He was no longer standing in the freezing wind of Sea Dragon Point. He was resting in the comforting warmth beneath the high table of the great hall. Through the red eyes of his direwolf, Jon saw the immense, roaring hearth fires. He smelled the rich scent of roasted mutton and spilled ale. He heard the deafening, joyous laughter of the northern lords. He saw the great Jon standing on a bench, singing a terrible song, and watched William Dustin slamming his tankard against the wood. Jon shifted Ghost's gaze upward. Sitting at the center of the high table, bathed in the firelight, was his older brother. Cregan looked broad and proud, wearing a cloak of pure white wool. Beside him sat Rhaenys, looking utterly radiant in deep crimson and black, her dark eyes shining with amusement as she watched the boisterous lords of the north. As Jon watched, the hall erupted into a chaotic cheer for the bedding ceremony. He saw Cregan stand, effortlessly sweeping his new bride into his arms, and make a dead sprint down the center aisle of the hall, outrunning the drunken lords and carrying Rhaenys safely out the heavy oak doors. Back in the yard of Sea Dragon Point, Jon opened his gray eyes. The freezing coastal wind bit at his cheeks, but a genuine smile had settled onto his usually solemn face. Chapter 120. The Summons of the Wolf. It had been 3 moons since the heavy vellum scroll bearing the direwolf seal had been unrolled on the table of the small council. The realm had already witnessed the horrific, staggering collapse of the Faith Militant at the edge of the neck. The survivors had limped back into the Riverlands and the Reach, spreading tales of impenetrable black towers and a warden who fed his enemies hot stew after breaking their crusade to splinters. The North had firmly locked its gates, proving itself entirely unassailable. And then, the king's ravens had flown. By royal decree, King Robert Baratheon had summoned the wardens and the lords of every kingdom to present themselves in the great hall of the Red Keep. The realm had not seen a gathering of this magnitude since the tourney at Harrenhal, long before the rebellion. On the great roads of Westeros, the dust rose in thick, choking clouds as the power of the 7 kingdoms marched toward the capital. No one knew exactly what the Lord of Winterfell intended to show them. They only knew that a king did not summon the entire realm without an undeniable cause. The procession of House Lannister was a display of overwhelming wealth, but their command circle did not discuss the future in a rattling wheelhouse. Inside the heavily guarded, private tent they had set for the night, Tywin Lannister sat with perfect, rigid posture. The Lord of Casterly Rock wore a doublet of dark crimson wool, his pale green eyes fixed on the ledger resting on the small table before him. His brother, Kevin, sat across from him. Tyrion Lannister lounged on a plush chair near the hearth, swirling a cup of deep red wine. Jaime Lannister, the heir to the Rock, sat nearby, his golden armor catching the firelight. "The crown owes us 1,000,000 dragons," Tywin said at last, his voice even. "And the Iron Bank is owed twice that. Lord Aaron's letter claims this council is to address the matter." Tyrion snorted softly into his wine. "And Eddard Stark has ridden 1,000 leagues to involve himself in accounting?" Tywin did not immediately respond. He closed the ledger with deliberate care. "No," he said. "He has not. Eddard Stark does not intrigue," he said. "He does not dissemble. And he does not move unless compelled." Tyrion raised an eyebrow. "Then we are to be reassured?" "No," Tywin said flatly. He leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers. "We are to be concerned." A quiet settled over the tent. "Robert Baratheon would not summon the realm for coin alone," Tywin continued. "He lacks the patience for it. And yet he has done so, at Stark's urging." Jaime's expression sharpened, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "You think Ned has finally decided to rule the 7 kingdoms?" Tywin's eyes flicked to him, cool and measured. If Eddard Stark desired power, he would have taken it during the Roberts Rebellion, Tywin said. He did not. That is precisely why this is troubling. Tyrion set his cup aside, now fully attentive. Stark and Robert trust one another, Tywin went on. That much is certain. Stark would not deceive him, and Robert would not doubt him. Kevin frowned. Then whatever this is, the king believes it. Yes, Tywin said. The single word hung heavily in the air. Jaime straightened slightly from the wall. So, he said, quieter now, either Ned Stark has changed, or something has happened that would make him leave the north and drag the entire realm into one room. Tywin's expression did not shift, but his voice dropped, colder than before. Eddard Stark does not change, he said. Men like him break before they bend. A long pause followed, which leaves us with only one possibility. Tyrion's mismatched eyes gleamed faintly in the firelight. Something has frightened the north. Tywin did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the wine, though he did not drink. When we reach King's Landing, he said at last, you will observe everything. You will listen to every word. And you will assume nothing. He looked at each of them in turn. If Stark has brought the realm together, it is not for ambition. A beat. It is because he believes he has no other choice. The fire cracked softly in the silence that followed. Even Jaime did not smile. The Rose Road House Tyrell. The Tyrell wheelhouse was a rolling garden of excess. Painted in green and gold, its carved roses catching the sunlight as it rumbled northward. Inside, Mace Tyrell paced with restless agitation, a goblet of arbor gold sloshing in his hand. This is a grave discourtesy, he declared, to summon the reach over matters of coin. Oh, do stop talking, Mace, snapped Olenna Tyrell, not even opening her eyes. You sound like a fishwife denied her morning gossip. Mace bristled. Mother, this concerns the dignity of Highgarden. This concerns something far more important than your dignity. Olenna cut in, her eyes opening sharply. The carriage fell quiet. You are making the same mistake as half the realm, she continued. You are asking what we have been summoned for. You should be asking why now. Mace frowned, thrown off. The hand's letter said. The hand's letter said what it needed to say, Olenna interrupted. But Eddard Stark is not Jon Arryn, and he is certainly not a man who rides south to tally debts. She shifted slightly in her seat, her expression sharpening. That man doesn't come to south without a reason. Mace's bluster faltered. Then why come now? He asked. Olenna studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether the answer was worth the effort. Because whatever waits in the capital, she said slowly, is important enough to drag a man like Stark out of the only place he trusts. She set her hands in her lap. And more troubling still, important enough that Robert Baratheon agreed to summon the entire realm at his request. Mace swallowed. You think the king is being led? I think the king is convinced, Olenna replied. And that is far worse. A silence stretched between them as the wheelhouse rolled on. After a moment, Olenna added, her voice quieter. When we enter the great hall, we will not sit at the front, preening for attention like peacocks. Mace opened his mouth. We will sit where we can see everything, she finished, her gaze hard as flint. And leave quickly if we must. The Boneway Dorne. The Dornish rode light and fast through the winding stone passes, their cloaks snapping in the dry wind. At their head rode Oberyn Martell, his expression thoughtful rather than amused. Beside him, Illyria Sand watched the long line of travelers filling the road ahead. They are all going, she said. Every lord, every banner. Oberyn nodded. Summoned like boys to a lesson they do not yet understand. That is not like the North, Illyria said. They do not call meetings. They endure. No, Oberyn agreed. They do not waste time on spectacle. He rode in silence for a few moments before continuing. Elia told me to go to King's Landing. When we went for Cregan's wedding, Illyria glanced at him. And it was brief, Oberyn said. He looked ahead, eyes narrowing slightly. She told me to go to King's Landing. Not as a prince. Not as an envoy. As what then? As a witness. Illyria's expression tightened. That does not sound like court intrigue. No, Oberyn said softly. It does not. He exhaled slowly. Elia does not frighten easily. She endured the court of Aerys II Targaryen and the aftermath of Robert's rebellion. If she tells us to listen, he let the thought hang. Illyria finished it quietly. Then we listen. Oberyn's mouth curved, but there was no humor in it now. The lions will suspect a scheme, he said. The roses will worry about advantage. The river lords will look for alliances. And you? Ilaria asked. Oberyn's gaze lifted toward the distant horizon. I think, he said, that Eddard Stark has seen something he cannot ignore. A pause. And that he intends to make sure no one else can ignore it either. The wind howled softly through the Boneway as they rode on toward the capital. The Riverlands. In a modest inn near the edge of the King's Road, Lord Hoster Tully sat near a roaring hearth, wrapping his thick traveling cloak tightly around his aging shoulders. The Lord of Riverrun looked frail, the years and a creeping sickness beginning to take their toll on his strength. He coughed a deep, rattling cough, accepting a cup of hot broth from his brother, Brynden. The Blackfish stood near the window of the inn, watching the endless stream of minor lords, merchant caravans, and velvet-draped southern pavilions passing by on their way to the capital. Look at them, Brynden scoffed, his voice carrying the rough, practical edge of a veteran soldier. Jesters, musicians, they are riding to a feast. Hoster took a slow sip of his broth. Jon Arryn is the hand. If the king calls a council, the Vale will attend. But this is not Jon Arryn's doing. This is Stark's. And Stark does not throw feasts for the south. Brynden finished the thought, crossing his arms and looking out at the gray, overcast sky. I fought beside him. He travels only with steel and salted meat. He doesn't play their games, Hoster. The man only calls the realm together when there is trouble on the horizon. The narrow sea. On the flagship, Eddard Stark stood near the prow, his face a mask of solemn, weathered stone. Beside him stood the great Jon, his massive battle-axe resting easily against the wooden railing. He brought only Lord Umber and 300 of his most lethal wolf guards. The giant lord of the last hearth was visibly agitated, constantly shifting his weight and glaring at the wooden planks beneath his boots. I hate the sea, Ned, the great Jon grumbled, spitting a wad of phlegm over the rail. There is no solid earth to plant your feet, and the smell from the hold is making my men sick. In the deepest cargo hold of the ship, chained securely to the heavy ironwood bulkheads, rested a single massive wooden box. It was wrapped tightly in thick, greased canvas and bound in heavy iron chains. For the entirety of the voyage, the thing inside the box had not stopped thrashing for a single hour. The relentless, wet sound of dead flesh scraping against timber and the groaning of metal chains echoed through the timbers of the ship, day and night. Do you think they will listen, Ned? The great Jon asked, his voice dropping as another hollow thud echoed from the hold below. The giant had seen the blue eyes of the White in Winterfell. The sheer terror of that memory had forever stripped him of his southern boasting. They will not want to, Ned replied, his tone entirely devoid of optimism. They will look for tricks. They will call it a mummer's farce, or a rare beast from Essos. Tywin Lannister will try to analyze it, and Mace Tyrell will try to ignore it. Ned pulled his heavy direwolf pelt tighter against his shoulders as the familiar, rocky coast of Blackwater Bay finally came into view. But they will listen, Ned promised, his voice hard as forged iron. Because I am not going to ask for their belief. I am going to lock the doors of the Great Hall, and I am going to open the box. King's Landing. The capital was bursting at the seams. The inns were completely overflowing, and a massive, sprawling city of silk pavilions and canvas tents had sprung up outside the mud gate to accommodate the thousands of guards, squires, and servants accompanying the great lords. When the northern carracks sailed into Blackwater Bay, the harbor fell completely silent. The massive, formidable warships dwarfed the southern merchant cogs and royal galleys. The northern column disembarked with the relentless, unyielding discipline of a veteran host. 300 men of the Wolf Guard formed a perfect perimeter on the docks. They did not sing. They did not break ranks. For heavy draft horses were blindfolded with thick leather patches and hitched to the heavy, canvas-wrapped wagon hauled up from the hold. The gold cloaks of the city watch quickly cleared a path, escorting the northern column up the steep, winding cobblestones of Aegon's high hill toward the Red Keep. The small folk crowded the streets, pressing against the walls of the buildings to make way. There were no cheers, but there were no thrown stones either. There was only a heavy, palpable awe. They had all heard the tales of the slaughter in the neck. They looked at the gray cloaks and the dark steel, seeing the men who had broken 50,000 zealots without a single casualty. As they rode through the massive bronze doors of the Red Keep's main courtyard, the lords of the realm were waiting. The balconies and the upper walkways were packed with the nobility of Westeros. Mace Tyrell stood with his sons. Tywin Lannister watched from a high window, his face unreadable. Prince Oberyn leaned casually against a stone pillar, a sharp, assessing smile on his face. Standing on the high steps of the Great Keep was Ser Barristan Selmy. The legendary knight watched the Wolf Guards march into the courtyard in perfect unison, the sound of their boots snapping together echoing off the high stone walls. Barristan was not surprised by their flawless coordination. He had seen them fight during the Greyjoy Rebellion. He remembered the swift, unyielding butchery of the Northern Vanguard. He looked at them now, noting that their eyes were fixed, their hands resting near their hilts. Barristan realized he was not looking at a ceremonial honor guard. He was looking at a highly lethal strike force ready to spill blood at a single word from their lord. Ned brought his destrier to a halt in the center of the courtyard. From the high steps of the Great Keep, the royal greeting party stood waiting. Queen Cersei wore a gown of rich crimson silk, her emerald eyes cold and unwelcoming. Beside her stood the 3 royal children. Princess Myrcella and Prince Tommen looked nervous, while Crown Prince Joffrey, golden-haired and draped in velvet, wore a visible, arrogant sneer on his face as he looked down at the grim, unadorned Northmen. The small council members, including Jon Arryn, Varys, and Peter Baelish, flanked the royal family. But King Robert Baratheon did not stand on ceremony. He marched down the stone steps, entirely ignoring the formalities of court. Robert was not the fat, drunken king in this timeline. Years of actively participating in the brutal Northern Games Ned had kept the king's massive frame corded with heavy, thick muscle. He looked as fit as a bull. Men in the yard whispered the king could take 3 knights at a time in the melee. "Ned!" Robert roared, his booming voice shattering the silence. Ned dismounted smoothly, handing his reins to a guard. He walked forward to meet his king. Robert caught him in a crushing embrace, slapping him hard on the back. As he clasped his friend, Robert's old warrior instincts flared. Beneath the heavy cloak, he felt the absolute, freezing tension radiating from Ned's muscles. Robert's booming laugh faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked into Ned's gray eyes and instantly realized this was not a reunion between friends, but the grim prelude to a battlefield. "By the gods, it is good to see your freezing face," Robert said, his tone losing some of its boisterous edge. "The swamp is secure?" "The swamp is secure, your grace," Ned replied quietly, pulling back from the embrace. Ned turned to face the crowded balconies and the gathered royal family, ensuring that every lord, every spy, and every whisperer in the Red Keep could hear his words. "Call the council tomorrow," the Warden of the North commanded, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Tell the lords of Westeros. They will know why they are here tomorrow."